Good evening. My name is Sylvia Schwag-Serger. I'm the president of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. I've been in this role for almost exactly 1 year, and I'm extremely pleased to welcome you to this seminar on public trust in science, safeguarding academic freedom and objectivity. So with those formalities out of the way, I really want to say how happy I am that we are organizing this seminar and with such a distinguished group of speakers and panelists. I've been looking forward to this conversation, and it really is something that is quite close to my heart. I'm a professor of research policy, and I've looked quite a lot at the role of higher education in society, and I think it's a highly topical subject. Just to give you one statistic, which I also mentioned recently in one of my newsletters, and that as some of you maybe have seen, that a Gallup poll published in September, done in the US, showed that only 35% of Americans today consider higher education to be very important. And that is a drop of 18 percentage points compared to just 6 years ago, which I think is quite striking and concerning. I was thinking before the seminar that when I look out into this room, I don't think in this room we have a problem with trust in science, but perhaps that's precisely the problem, that there is such a big divide. And how do we handle this divide and this fact that so many people, for example, in the US, don't seem to consider a higher education something that is very important to have. And on a more personal note, having grown up in a Chinese-American-German household, I can tell you that my Chinese-American grandfather, that was the one thing he told me throughout my childhood, you know, get a good education. No one can take that away from you. And I'm just wondering, I think it would be interesting to reflect upon that today. Has the world changed? Have we changed? You know, and what is it that we can do about the current situation if we are, in fact, looking at a continuous erosion of public trust in science? I also want to be a little bit positive, and one thing that I find striking is that this erosion of the public trust in science is not, I would say, global, which is also something we should talk about. I mean, for example, in Sweden, you know, universities are still institutions where the public has a very high confidence in them and trust in these institutions. So there are actually quite significant differences, for example, compared to the US, and that's also something we might want to reflect upon, how we explain that. But also, I think, as you said, Ulrika, in one previous session, how do we actively manage that confidence or that faith that the public still has in higher education in Sweden? Because again, I think there's nothing we can take for granted today. So with these introductory words, we're gonna start off with 3 sort of short interventions, and then we'll have a panel. And as I said, we welcome questions or comments also from you. And we're very happy to start with Anna Maria Fleetwood, who just told me she's from the Swedish National Research Council, has spent more than 2 decades on science communication, so I think she's thought quite extensively about this topic, and we look very much forward to hearing your opening remarks. Please go ahead.
So first, thank you kindly for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here today. And I'm from the Swedish Research Council. And I think I'm really excited to talk about strengthening public trust in science. I think it's pivotal today what's going on a global level. And just shortly a little bit about the Swedish Research Council. We are the largest governmental research funding body in Sweden. We support research within all the fields, and we are also advisors to the government. On top of that, or included in that, is that we also have a national mandate to coordinate science communication on a national level. And with that comes a vision that we have, and that is that the science communication should become useful for anyone that actually wants to use it. And this is in order to strengthen the democratic society. So now it went too fast. With this picture over there, you can see that it's Researchers' Night, which is coordinated by Public and Science in Sweden, and we are supporting them. And this is a very sort of, it's 27 locations in Sweden who are arranging this and letting young people meeting researchers, and researchers meeting young people too. On the other side is the contest that is called Researchers Grand Prix, which is a contest that is where we try, they are contestant, the researchers are trying to really be as captivating, inspiring, and educational in a way that they really can do it to interest people around them and in the public. And for those researchers, we are coaching all the researchers so that they actually can be better on presenting their science. In this contest, they have to do it in just 4 minutes. And what they say afterwards is that, and even a few years afterwards, that this has really been useful, that they really trained to do this and got the coaching from the different councils. So with that in mind, Sylvia was talking about the states. It's a global phenomenon, and we can see that from 2004 to 2024, the democracies has inclined, and the autocracy are really moving forward. But on the other hand, we can see that on a European level, that trust in science is quite high. And even in Sweden, where Public and Science is doing surveys, we can see that it's high. This doesn't mean that trust in science is equal with following science-based recommendations. And with that, what are actually the barriers for trust in science? And what we've seen is that it's been constantly and increasingly tested because mis- and disinformation is really everywhere now. It's also moving into the hands of many. Before it was in institutional or universities and so on. And that means also that the ecosystem of trust is really, really broadening. And also there's a focus on common sense and gut feeling that true people are believed to have a special ability to perceive the truth and also has an instinct that guides them correctly. Anti-elitism leads to skepticism and towards expert knowledge. And I've been coaching researchers for over 2 decades. And those are some of the reasons that I have compiled over the year why you as a researcher actually are doing dissemination, why you are taking part in debate, why you're writing articles, why you're interacting, or why you even co-create with people outside academia. And they tell me that it is to reach a wider audience, gives them new opportunities to get increased also recognition, it gives them new ideas. It also opened up new collaboration, which is really important in those days. And also it encouraged a new generation to get involved in higher education. It also gives them extra citation. And in Sweden, it's also the law. Lately, I have added a few drivers when I talk to researchers, and that is that as a researcher, you're also helping to counter disinformation and propaganda, both on an individual but also on a systematic level. And also by taking part in the media, you are strengthening the free media, and you're also improving the quality of the debate. So fostering trust in science is, I think, mostly about those three things. Trustworthy science, which includes promoting research and integrity, transparency, ethical practices, and also inclusivity. And all those is included in the concept that everyone is, almost all researchers are involved in, and that's open science. And from the Research Council, good research practice is actually the report that is most downloaded. Then when it comes to science communication, I think it's important that we are reforming the academic incentives, providing training and resources, and also ensuring the open access to different knowledge, and also to do it effectively and tailoring formats. We have, at the Swedish Research Council, developed a framework for courses for PhD students. I would shortly talk about that. We also are running 2 websites, and we are also running something that is called Faktaforskning. I would probably, I don't know if it's correct, but say get or grasp science, and that is really about science literacy. How can you make a difference between a pure opinion and facts, and how is the focus really is to ensure and highlight the science literacy, the process, the methods that you as a researcher and scientist are using. I was talking shortly about this framework. It was 3 parts, and it has been implemented on a few universities in Sweden. We did it together with 15 experts, mostly researchers, and a few communication experts. And also afterwards, it was implemented as a pilot at Örebro University. And the first model is researchers' role in society, and here we're really talking about the value and purpose of science communication, how to cope with knowledge, resistance, the role of the academy, and the role of you as a researcher, and also, of course, open science and norms and ethics. So trust in science is something really dominating everywhere right now. And I would just want to mention 3 different things that is coming up this autumn. The first is a high-level conference in Paris, and it actually is called, it's named Trust in Science, and it's Science Europe in collaboration with ANR in France. The next one is Qualès, which is the European Competence Center, and they have a theme on trust in science. The third one is an ERA action, where Sweden is going to be the sponsor, together with the Bundesministerium in Germany and ALEA. And this is going to continue until 2027, and this is also totally focused on how we can make it more resilient and enhance trust in science. So, some reflection and future directions when it comes to science communication. It is an independent research field, which is, I think, important to remember. It is also part of open science. it is a part of the research process. It's not something that the researchers do in the beginning and then in the end. It has to be a part of the whole process. It also really fosters trust in researcher. I am a true believer of that message. And it also, as we say at the Swedish Research Council, it contributes to excellent science. And last but not least, it contributes also to building a democratic society. And that was my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. That was, I think, a very good opening, and also thank you for establishing this link, or I think that's something we might want to talk a little bit more about, the link between trust in science and democracy, which I think is a very important and interesting one. The next speaker we're very pleased to welcome is Professor Marie-Laure Salle from the Geneva Graduate Institute and also an EVA Fellow. And Professor Salle is a distinguished scholar in organizational theory and institutional change with a long-standing engagement in global governance, diplomacy, and the societal role of academia. And we're very happy that she will share with us today her perspectives on trust in science and academic freedom from an European and an international viewpoint. Please, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you very much for having me. It's really a privilege to be here and to be able to share ideas with this room. I started actually with the same premise as you did, which is that in this room, probably we don't need to actually make the case, and we can take for granted that we all believe in the importance of science and in the essential role of a strong and independent university, not only for innovation and progress, but also, as you mentioned, for democracy and for a healthy democracy. I'll structure my remarks in essentially two parts with a conclusion. So the first part, I will actually focus on the current dynamics contributing to the erosion of public trust in science, because even if the figures are high, there are trends that go in that direction, high in Europe. Second, I will turn to the state of academic freedom, and then I will finish actually building on and referencing a recent French report that offers a comprehensive set of proposals to counter the decline in academic freedom and to restore public confidence in science. And it's a report, I think, that is going to actually circulate widely at the European level. So let me start with the question of public trust in science. Trust in science does not just happen. It needs to be sustained, and it rests, I would argue, on a number of essential foundations, and some of them have been also already mentioned by Anna Maria. First, it does require integrity, both of the scientific process and of the scientist. Second, science needs to remain independent, both of political agendas and economic interests. It should serve the public interest and the common good, not ideology or profit, and I will come back to that. Third, science must be meaningfully engaged with society as a collaborative effort to address real-world challenges. It should not be a detached and purely elite pursuit. Trust in science, finally, also requires, and that's been already mentioned, transparency and accessibility. Scientific knowledge has to be communicated clearly, shared openly, and made available to all in a very inclusive kind of manner. This has been already mentioned. Yet there's a paradox here, I would argue, because the moment science steps out of its ivory tower to engage with society and with its many challenges, and we need science to engage with the many challenges that we're facing, it does become vulnerable to the very pressures that threaten to undermine its legitimacy, political or ideological instrumentalization, economic capture, but also, and this is a bit of a different point, but I think we need to think about it, the dynamics inherent to science when it functions as a social field. Let me unpack what I mean here. What is implied is that some of the forces that undermine the legitimacy of science come, in fact, from its own internal dynamics. The way science is organized, evaluated, and published can create distortions that erode public trust. For example, the increasing hyper-specialization of science, along with rigid disciplinary and even subdisciplinary boundaries, has arguably contributed to a research system that often appears quite disconnected from the very complex and systemic nature of contemporary challenges. At the same time, intense competitive pressures, such as, for example, the publish or perish culture, and the outsized influence of gatekeepers can foster a sense of opacity and exclusion. Layered hierarchies, growing bureaucratic demands, and a pervasive audit culture, coupled with peer review and publishing norms that tend to favor conformity, have their advantages and strengths, but they can also stifle innovation, discourage intellectual risk-taking, and limit the diversity of perspectives that are needed for science to thrive and to remain relevant, particularly in the current context of radical uncertainty and complexity that we live in. So it's essential, I think, to acknowledge those self-generated dynamics because they arguably contribute to the erosion of public trust in science. Let me just propose a few illustrative examples. The imperative to publish or perish can, in practice, incentivize quantity over quality, pushing scholars towards safer, shorter-term projects at the expense of more ambitious, longer-term explorations that carry greater intellectual risks and maybe also more rewards in terms of dealing with the challenges that I mentioned, but will delay publishing and carry rewards. Moreover, double-blind peer review processes, while designed to ensure fairness, often reinforce prevailing paradigms, leading to a normalization and an homogenization of knowledge. Let me also briefly underscore, beyond those internal dynamics, and that's another one, it's not far from anecdotal, the damaging impact of scientific misconduct on public trust. Such breaches of integrity are more than isolated incidents. They often reflect deeper systemic pressures embedded in today's research environment. Intense competition and accountability-driven governance, I mentioned already, explain in part a lot of those cases of misconduct. The relentless pursuit of publication, recognition, and funding can create conditions where ethical boundaries are tested or ignored. While I will not cite specific cases here, a lot of you certainly think of many different ones, and they actually happen in all disciplines. And each case serves as a really stark reminder to us, should serve as a stark reminder to us, that integrity in science is non-negotiable. And when the scientific community itself fails to uphold and enforce its own standards, then public confidence inevitably falters, and the credibility of science as a trustworthy societal institution is put at risk. So really important, I think, to remember that there are very powerful internal dynamics, but there are also obviously external trends, one of which is financing. The sources, the structures, and the conditions of research funding exert a profound influence, whether we like it or not, on the scientific enterprise, shaping not only what gets researched and for what purpose, but also how questions are framed and even who owns the result of that research. I will mention here only a few well-known trends in Western countries. A well-documented trend since the 1980s has been a kind of growing dominance or increase of private sector investment in research and development, or if it's not private sector funding, public sector funding, but with a private sector orientation. This shift has had significant implication. One of the most notable consequences is a reinforced emphasis on hard sciences, particularly those fields that promise rapid innovation and commercial application. And as private funding and the mindset that goes with it increasingly drives the agenda also of public funders, what we see is that marketable technologies, disciplines that yield marketable technologies or immediate economic returns tend to be prioritized, often at the expense of more exploratory or socially oriented research. I'm a social scientist, let alone of humanities. And yet, I would argue, we have never needed quality research in social sciences and humanity as we do today. Another well-established trend that deserves mention is the foundational role that military research and development has played in shaping modern science and technology over the 20th century. A significant portion of the scientific advances that we rely on today have been originally conceived and developed within the context of war and defense to meet strategic military objectives. I think it's worth pausing a moment to ask ourselves, what would our science and research look like if they had been framed and financed from the beginning for peace and long-term human security and well-being, rather than for war and short-term military security? In September 2024, the UN Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board published a statement on trust in science. So it's really, it's a fashionable topic. It was noted in this statement that public trust in science is increasingly undermined by a lot of the trends that we've been mentioning: perceptions of elitism, politicization, misinformation, the erosion of evidence-based thinking, and conflicts of interest. But strikingly, the document did not address what may be a deeper socio-cultural explanation for the erosion of public trust in science, and to which I would now want to turn. This trend, third trend, I argue, is cultural and societal in nature, and it has origins both inside and outside the scientific community. At its core lies a profound paradigmatic shift in the epistemological framing of science itself. We might describe this as the end of positivism and the growing recognition that all scientific knowledge is situated and contextual, and this applies broadly across disciplines. This recognition has, in many ways, opened a kind of Pandora's box. The idea of a single objective truth has been unsettled, and science has to some extent been dislodged from its pedestal. Let me be clear, this is not a call to reverse course or to suppress the critical insights that have emerged from this evolution, insights that were both necessary and long overdue. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle, and it should not. Science is situated, it's framed, it's contextual. But if we are to fully grasp the current crisis of trust in science, I would argue that we must not all overlook the fact that this particular evolution has had an impact on the perception of scientific authority in the public sphere. This epistemological shift parallels another one that has been mentioned by Anna Maria, which is a profound societal evolution towards the democratization of our societies and particularly of education, and the unprecedented direct access to information that is enabled particularly by digital technologies today. Today, vast amounts of knowledge are available directly to individuals, often bypassing the traditional scientific intermediaries. This obviously does not mean that knowledge is unmediated. If anything, algorithms are the new intermediaries, and we should really focus on that and talk about that. But the dominant perception is one of direct and unmediated access. Arguably, this development could be seen to represent, in the realm of knowledge, a kind of functional equivalent to the Protestant Reformation, a move away from centralized elite and top-down authority towards individual horizontal appropriations. Individuals have the means and increasingly the confidence to access and interpret information independently without relying on the traditional gatekeepers of scientific knowledge, on the priorists of science, on scientists. This shift has fundamentally challenged the traditional authority of change, of science and scientists, marking a departure from an era of unquestioned trust. In this place, we see the rise of individual agency, where people feel empowered to form their own judgment. In June, and I'll give an example of a case in the US. In a June 2025 interview with Tucker Carlson, Robert Kennedy Jr., US Secretary of Health and Human Services, made a very provocative statement. And he said, I quote, "Trusting the experts is not a feature of science or democracy. It is a feature of religion and totalitarianism." This is obviously a very striking claim, one that flips conventional wisdom on its head, suggesting that reliance on scientific expertise is not a rational and enlightened choice, but a form of blind faith comparable to religious dogma or authoritarian obedience. This rhetorical maneuver echoes, obviously, Orwell's Newspeak from 1984, where war becomes peace, ignorance becomes strength, and freedom becomes slavery. By reframing public trust in science as a surrender of personal judgment rather than a mark of informed citizenship, Kennedy taps into and amplifies the existing skepticism that I was mentioning before. Mistrust, in that context, is reinvented as a virtue, a kind of democratic virtue in a sense, and intellectual independence. From this vantage point, he's able to launch broader attacks, such as his denunciation of leading medical journals that corrupt, accusing them of routinely punishing studies funded and vetted by the very industries they are meant to scrutinize. So I think it's really important to understand this deeper trend. Let me now turn to the issue of academic freedom. Globally, academic freedom is under threat. According to Scholars at Risk Free to Think 2024 report, we've seen 391 attacks on higher education communities between July 2023 and June 2024, a sharp increase from 297 the previous year. The Academic Freedom Index, which is produced since 2019 by a coalition of organizations that includes Scholars at Risk and VDEM, which has already been mentioned, only confirms the trajectory. Over the past decade, 34 countries have experienced statistically significant declines in academic freedom, while only 8 have shown improvement. This marks the first sustained global decline in academic freedom since World War II, reversing decades of progress. It's been mentioned, the figures on democracy have been mentioned. Strangely enough, the figures here are quite parallel. 3.6 billion people, roughly 45% of the global population, now live in countries where academic freedom is severely restricted. It's interesting to note that organizations such as Scholars at Risk or the Academic Freedom Index focus on documenting formal violations of academic freedom, yet beyond those overt breaches, I would like to suggest that there's a more subtle and pervasive trend, a rise in self-censorship within universities, a phenomenon that is clearly global in scope. The European Parliament has developed an annual academic freedom monitor, which complements quantitative data with qualitative studies. The report shows that even in countries with strong formal protections for academic freedom, informal pressures and fear of backlash can lead to widespread self-censorship. In 2025, the Council of Europe launched a series of 10 policy briefs under its Academic Freedom Insights initiative, one of which focuses specifically on self-censorship in academia. This brief identifies key drivers such as political pressure, whether internal to the university or external, social backlash and institutional constraints, and warns of the emergence of, quote-unquote, a spiral of silence that can take hold even in the absence of formal censorship. The brief calls for proactive measures to cultivate environments where diverse ideas can be expressed freely, emphasizing that self-censorship undermines universities' role as the critical conscience of society. Despite its significance, this phenomenon remains insufficiently studied and documented, I would argue. Yet the trend is broad and increasingly visible. Obviously, in the US too, American universities have been very significantly affected, even more over the last year. One, just very fast, because I might be running a little bit out of time, but I would like just to mention that one of the mechanisms of this self-censorship are the increasing role of denunciation practices, which have emerged as powerful drivers of self-censorships. And those obviously are, again, increasingly strong and visible in the US, but they are also quite visible in a number of European countries. In France, for example, they've played a big role, and they take the form very often of social media campaigns, denunciation from inside, but also from outside. The role of the media and social media here is extremely important. I will not say much on the Trump effect because I think that maybe we'll hear more about it after, but I think we all realize, obviously, that I think that one thing that needs to be said at that stage is that there is a very organized and very structured attack on universities, not just a chance happening. This has been going on and has been prepared for a long time. I guess a lot of you have seen this speech by J.D. Vance at the National Conservatism Conference in 2021, which was titled "Universities Are the Enemy." That, I think, if you haven't, I think you should, because you understand that indeed this is very much, a political project. Very much a political project, by the way, strongly influenced by Orban's own work in Hungary. So there's circulations of ideas, and this, counter-influences are very interesting. Today, this is going the other way through the 2025 project, which has been actually materializing this, policy in the US over the last 8 and 9 months. Now the 2025 project is being circulated in Europe, in a number of political parties, in a number of countries, and possibly we'll see the impact of this in time. So I'll go to my conclusion, basically I will actually focus only in that conclusion, even though I had a lot more to say, but I will just focus on what is to be done. And I will make a reference to this recent report that I mentioned that was published last week, I think, titled Defending and Promoting Academic Freedom. It was commissioned by France universities, so I guess probably in the conference that you mentioned, there will be a discussion of that report, which is the Alliance of French University Presidents, and this report was written by Sciences Po professor Stéphanie Balme. Although written in a national context, its ambition is clearly European, and it proposes a set of actionable proposals that could be coordinated across the continent. The report warns first that academic freedom is no longer under threat solely in authoritarian regime, and even in European countries where we feel we are relatively protected, it's also under strain. It draws parallels with developments in the US and documents concerning trends in France, like political interference in university governance, conditional public funding tied to vague ideological conditions, social media attacks on scholars, I mentioned that, and growing restrictions on access to research sites and grants. These developments reflect a broader shift towards the politicization of knowledge and the erosion of university autonomy. The report also warns that despite France's democratic tradition, legal and cultural protections for academic freedom are very weak, leaving universities very vulnerable to both political and private pressures. Many of these concerns likely resonate beyond France across other European countries. The report puts forward a total of 65 recommendations, so I will not go through the 65 recommendations, and we can group them in 3 categories. One is legal recommendations, second is organizational and governance, and the third one is cultural, and I only highlight a few. In the legal recommendations, one key proposal is to enshrine academic freedom as a fundamental constitutional principle. The report also underscores the need for complementary legislative measures, including a framework law that would define the scope of academic freedom, establish procedural safeguards, and reinforce institutional autonomy for universities. It calls for the creation of a legal regime protecting the confidentiality of research sources, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, modeled on the protections afforded to journalism. Second, the organizational and governance recommendations. To make academic freedom operational, the report calls for a structural overhaul of university governance and support systems. Key proposals include the automatic activation of protective measures for academics under threat and the appointment of dedicated academic freedom representatives within each institution. Universities are also encouraged to adopt academic freedom charters, establish ethical funding committees, and implement training programs for both staff and students. Finally, beyond legal and institutional measures, the report emphasizes the need to foster a broader societal culture, and this bit, Anna Maria, what you're doing, that values and defends academic freedom. Among its proposals are a national awareness campaign, the transformation of France's annual science festival into a science and academic freedom festival, and the establishment of an academic freedom award to honor exemplary initiatives. At the European level, the report urges France to take the lead in creating a European observatory for academic freedom, integrating academic freedom indicators into university rankings, and promoting a European label for institutions committed to the protection of academic freedom. So thank you very much. Sorry for having been a bit long, and I'm looking very much forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Marie-Laure. I think we're seeing a very interesting sort of picture emerge, I think, with Anna Maria talking about the link perhaps both between democracy and science, but also important of science communication. And with you looking at both internal factors that might explain partially what we're witnessing today, but also external factors. And I think this link between academic freedom and trust in science. And for me, it raises the question, does erosion of academic freedom erode trust in science or vice versa? Or is there a third factor that explains both? But also the question, I think, from your talk at the end, and I know Stéphanie quite well, one of the things that concerns me is when we're starting to have a conversation that we might have to protect science from society. is that actually something, or that seems to me a much more fundamental problem if we think we've come to that. But that's something we can come back to. I'm very much looking forward now to hear the opening statements and intervention from Professor Richard Murray, also a newly elected EVA Fellow from the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and a world-leading expert in automatic control. Professor Murray has made significant contributions across engineering, biology, and computing. You have strong ties to Sweden through long-standing collaborations, including with Lund University and the WASP program, where you chair the International Scientific Advisory Board. So we're very happy to hear your opening remarks.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come speak and for your introduction. And what I'd like to talk about, of course, is a little bit of a US perspective on academic freedom and curiosity-driven research. And so we can think about this as sort of science. And I should say, so I'm coming to you as an engineer, not a scientist, an engineering researcher. I'm coming from an elite private university in the United States. And so you'll see that some of those biases kind of come through. I want to talk to you about 4 things. One is academic freedom and tenure, and the importance of tenure in what goes on. Another is the use of that academic freedom and tenure through something I think is very important for international relations, and that is sabbaticals and academic exchanges and the role that that plays in creating a worldwide network. And then I want to say a little bit about the funding of basic research in the United States and the structure of that. As we've already heard, many of these things are under a lot of pressure, but that's a very important one to really support, again, all of the things that we talk about. And then talk some about the current challenges to academic freedom and trust. And of course, that theme runs through many different things. Okay, so let me start by just saying a little bit about academic freedom and tenure in the US. It's a little bit different, perhaps. In Europe, there are many different countries, and it's sort of done in many different ways. In the United States, if you go back to 1815, there were a relatively small number of universities in the United States. And in fact, one thing to remember is that most of those are private universities, right? Many of them formed under religious auspices. And so a few state universities, but you should be thinking Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, Hopkins, right? These were all universities, right, that were started many, many years ago. And were started in very different ways. They were not national universities, right? They were not, the equivalent of many of the universities in Europe started by the national governments, right? But rather, sometimes by state governments, often by private things. That grew a lot over the years, and by 1915, there were many more universities across the United States. And it was in 1915 that university professors formed the American Association of University Professors, which is one of the organizing bodies that sets some of the academic freedom and tenure guidelines in the US. And so the AAUP was formed, and they, as they were being formed in 1915, talked about the importance of the right to teach, the right to do research, and the right to publish without interference. And this was academic freedom as they defined it. They built on perspectives that came from around the world, and and in particular from Europe, and this is where many people had come from. But it was really done in part to try and separate out the politics, the religion, and donors. Right? And there were instances, for example, there's one where at Stanford, right, a professor was fired, all right, because of what they were teaching in their class, because the Stanford family, which what started the university, did not like what they were hearing. Right? And so in 1915, the AAUP said we need to establish a framework that, much like we see in other countries, and Europe in particular, Germany in particular, we can do that. So it was really driven by many of the concerns coming from private universities. So they put together a document that sort of evolved over time. But by 1940, the AAUP Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Trust. It's not a very long document. It's only about 2 pages. Very nicely written. It has a section on academic freedom, and you see that basically these 3 things: teaching, research, and publication, as well as academic tenure, right? And this notion that you cannot be fired, right, for deciding on what you teach or other things. And of course, this now pervades, democratic societies, but also the US. So tenure was really the mechanism for me that I think of as really institutionalizing that academic freedom, right? What does it mean to have academic freedom if you don't have tenure, right, in some sense, right? If you could get fired because what you're talking about or what you're teaching or what you're doing research on is not popular, that would be a problem. And so it really guarantees that. But another thing to keep in mind is that in the US, academic freedom and tenure are contractual. There's no legal basis for it. There's not a national law. There's no California law that guarantees academic freedom and tenure, right? There's simply a contract that I signed as a university professor, right, with Caltech that said you are guaranteed academic and freedom and tenure by your contract with this university, right? And so that's a little bit different. It's not enshrined in any law, right? And so, but it is more or less universal, but it can be changed, right? And so state governments can stay at state universities, and this is, of course, something that's happening, right? We're going to get rid of tenure, right? And that can be done because that's just a set of contracts between that university and the professors at that university. The professors could all leave, right? Or they could adopt that. So maybe that's a little bit different than it is in other parts where it's a little bit more ingrained. I think here in Sweden, for example, it's written into the law, right, that academic freedom are important principles and will be implemented. Not so. However, virtually all universities follow the AAUP principles. Okay, so that's one piece of all of that. And so I also just want to say that academic and freedom are also a type of trust. In this case, a trust between the university professors and the university, right? The university has to trust that, right, by allowing me to decide how I'm going to teach my classes or what I'm going to do in my research, and that will be good for the university, right? And they make that decision, right, when they hire me and when they give me tenure. And at the point that they give me tenure, they basically say, we trust that Richard Murray for the rest of, right, the time that he's at Caltech, and I've been at Caltech for 34 years, right, is going to do things that live up to the standards of Caltech and other things. And if I do or don't, as long as it's not for not doing my job at all, right, then I can continue to be employed. Okay, so that's one mechanism of trust, is in the way that academic freedom and tenure are implemented at universities. I think one of the important parts about that, and I want to talk about it here because it's also a very important part of my own interactions, is the role that tenure plays in practice, right, in terms of allowing pivots and new insights, right? So here we're talking about just the trust in science and the public and other things, but I think also we want to look at the effect that it has on university researchers, right? Our ability to move into new fields and to do different things, right? It allows us to change direction, right, and move in risky directions, right, without having to worry about, geez, I could lose my job if this doesn't work out, right? I can go into those new directions knowing that, right, I'm safe on the job front, and I can think about doing things over the next decade or the next two, and I've had the advantage in my own career of doing that several times. And so I take as my, kind of one of my examples of somebody who did this, Carver Mead. And Carver Mead was a faculty member at Caltech. You may have heard of him. He was, among other things, one of the inventors of VLSI, a very large-scale systems integration, which underlies all of the circuits and other things. And Carver was somebody who, you say, every 17 years, he tries to completely change fields. Right? Why 17? I have no idea, but that was his number. And so, and what he meant by that was that he would simply say, look, I've been working in this area. I think I've done what I can do in this area. I'm going to move into a new area. He would start saying no to people saying, Carver, we want you to do the next thing. No, I think I want to do something different. What do you want to do? I want to do this thing over there. What the heck is that? Right? And nobody in that area is going to give him money, right? But he did that in an amazing way. And he did a lot of different things, right? Semiconductor devices, VLSI design, neuromorphic circuits, a lot of the things that we see in learning and other things, perception, learning, and other areas really are things that Carver changed and did. Collective electrodynamics was his most, sort of the one he did right before he retired. But also he was doing a ton in entrepreneurship and starting companies and other things, right? Nobody said he could do it, but nobody said he couldn't, so he did, right? So he was one of my real role models for thinking about my own career and the things that I did. A second model was Carl-Johan Åström from here in Sweden. And Carl also was somebody, right, who just did an amazing number of things over his career, many of them within the field of control, right? But if you're within the field of control, and some of my colleagues are here, right, the things he did early in his career in stochastic control, but moved into system identification, these are now major areas, right? And he was at the start of all of these, right? So again, I think, Sweden demonstrated that ability, right, to allow someone through its system to do that. And similarly across many different application areas, right? Not just, focused on one particular sector. So I think these are great examples of the importance, right, of academic freedom and tenure. I think one of the ways that that happens, and is an interesting way to have it happen, is through the role of sabbaticals. So I'm on sabbatical right now. This is my 4th sabbatical, right? At Caltech, we get a sabbatical every 7th year, so Sabbath, like the Sabbath. And so I'm now on my 4th. And each one has allowed me to change directions and learn new things. The first one, I went into big industry and learned a little bit about how industry worked. The second one, I shifted my field from automatic control and robotics and aerospace applications to synthetic biology, an area I now work in. The next one, I really want to learn about entrepreneurship. And so I went up to San Francisco and spent a year learning about how small companies work. And one of my students was forming his own company, and so I played a role with that. And right now, I'm on sabbatical living in Washington, D.C., learning about sort of the political system and how that works. As you can imagine, this is a very interesting time to try to learn about that in a system where nobody knows what the heck's going on. And so, nonetheless, right, that's what I did. And Caltech is allowing me to do this. Caltech is allowing me to be gone for 21 months, right, to spend time in Washington, D.C., right, to learn at a very interesting time in Washington, D.C., how is it that science and technology policy gets done, right? And so in my own kind of career, I've made use of this, and it's academic freedom and tenure that allow that to happen. And it certainly benefited me. I hope it benefits Caltech. I hope it benefits our country. So I think the other thing is doing that through academic exchanges. And this is one of the things that through the VOS program here in Sweden, for example, we just hosted 36 PhD students at Caltech in the LA area, but at Caltech. And so it was an amazing academic exchange, right, where they come in here. This is how things are done differently in the United States versus how they're done where I'm from and other things. And of course, Europe is great at this in terms of sending people around, but it's an incredibly important part of academic freedom to be able to go and do that and to learn new things from different people. And finally, just, I think I'm learning as I go spend time in government how little understanding there is about how the university system works, at least in the US government, in some parts of that government. And so I think spending time doing that is useful. Okay, so sabbaticals and academic exchange, I think, are really enablers for new ideas. And if any country wants to be a place where lots of innovation is happening, you need not only academic and freedom and tenure, but the mechanisms to implement that, of which things like sabbaticals and academic exchanges are one. Okay, so let me say a little then about the US funding system and really talk about Vannevar Bush's endless frontier, right? This is the sort of model that we often use, right? And so, this was written right after World War II, and of course the US had invested a ton in technology and, right, sort of in the war. And Vannevar Bush said, we need to keep doing this, and that investment in basic research will pay off in the long term, trust me, right? And so this idea that would happen. And in the way that this often gets articulated in the US, it was sort of described as, well, we're going to invest in basic research that will lead to applied research that will eventually lead to development of products that will eventually lead to production and, sort of economic gain, right? But what was articulated very well was the importance of investing in that basic research and doing that in a way that was curiosity driven, right? That was, and again, we heard a little bit about this already, right? That wasn't just saying, I want to solve this problem, but I want to sort of understand something scientifically that might lead to solving a problem. And this did lead to many different agencies, including some defense agencies, but also the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health. And even within the defense agencies, basic research, what's called 6-1 research in the US system, right, is often very open-ended, right? And it might have some tie, right, but they try. And I think those of us who are doing that type of research try and think of it as, yes, there's a defense use of this, but it is going to help society broadly, right? That's harder and harder to do sometimes. I think also that it's not quite the right model, right? There's actually a feedback system. I'm a controls guy, right? So I had to put a feedback diagram in here someplace, right? So, it's really something where basic knowledge, right, can lead into basic research, but basic knowledge can also go directly into applied research, right? And applied knowledge sometimes helps out basic research as we sort of figure something out, we develop a new instrument, right, whatever it happens to be. And so really there's a feedback system and interaction between those, and maintaining that healthy interaction, I think, is an important part of getting the funding system to work. And by and large, in the US, I think this works fairly well in the sense that we have lots of interaction with industry and other things. We have people coming in, and there are different mechanisms for doing that in different countries, but it does tend to work fairly well. Okay, so coming back to trust, right? This sort of model, right, requires fundamentally that the public support, right, a model of research in which there's investment of their tax dollars, right, in basic research, right? So there's some notion that public funding supports this trust-based model of research. We do that by peer review, right? The things that get selected because there's a peer review process. We do that by making sure that we try and support curiosity-driven research and doing that in a way that we don't worry, ideally, about what the eventual benefits are. And of course, we're struggling, I think, as a world, but also as a country, to articulate this in a way that resonates with the public. and resonates with the government. But there's so many examples. And so I put 3 examples here of the basic studies of coherent light that people were doing that eventually led to lasers, the basic studies just trying to understand the science of nuclear magnetic resonance that eventually led to MRI, and trying to understand bacterial immune systems and the amazing things happening in biology that led to CRISPR. And of course, each of these won a Nobel Prize, and so, right, each of them recognized, right, that basic science that was really done just curiosity-driven. Nobody was thinking lasers was the way you're going to have that happen. So we know this, we understand this in this room very much, but how do we articulate that better? How do we communicate that better so that the government continues to support the basic research that allows that to happen? Okay, so this endless frontier model really creates this virtuous cycle, right? And we'd like to, find ways to continue that virtuous cycle. I think that, has been evident, over the 75 years or so that we've been implementing that model in the US. We'll see what that model looks like in another 3.5 years, as, there's a big discussion going on in the US about what that should look like and what it will look like. Okay, so maybe just to kind of summarize all of that, I think that there's a trust network for academic research. And institutional trust between universities and faculty, national trust between government and universities, and societal trust between public and the government, right? And so again, sort of a feedback diagram, right? All of these things interact. It's a complicated network, right? And so to some extent, it's not just that we have to communicate directly to the public, sort of this is useful, but the government all has to believe that and implement that, and the public, right? Eventually elects the government and all of those things, right? But these interactions between academic freedom, tenure, right? The use of things like sabbatical, public support and trust, right? All of these build upon one another and create an innovation system. And so how do we think about that very complicated system in a way that we can kind of articulate why it's important, but also act upon it? All right. And as we're seeing, right, it is unfortunately, right, a trust network that's somewhat fragile. It requires that politics and short-term incentives stay in check, right? We can't just be saying, look, we need to solve this problem right now. That won't lead to that investment in basic science. Politics, right, is driving a lot of things, right? Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. But, I think that if you want to invest in basic research, it needs to be free from the politics that are doing. And of course, this model can fail, right, if public confidence or institutional integrity. And we've heard this already, right? The scientific enterprise, I think, needs to really live up to its part as well. Okay, so I think we have to worry about what happens when that trust network begins to fray, and clearly it is beginning to fray. All right, so just, current challenges, I don't think there's anything here new. This is another chart of the same types of things that you've seen before. This is looking at a specific question. There are lots of questions. I love this booklet. It's got a lot of different questions. There's one in here where I think the one that's closest to this in Sweden, right, this would be, what is the public's trust of scientists, right? Not universities, not science, but scientists. And we see that that's gone from 86% down to 73%, and it's coming up a little bit now. But the negative bars there are getting big too, right? 13% don't trust it to the 23%. That's a doubling, right, of what's going on. In Sweden, this number I would say is above 80%, if I look at the kind of chart that I think corresponds most to that. And so for us, this is worrisome, right, that this is going down. Again, there are lots of these different statistics. You've seen many of them already. And we understand why, right? The pandemic certainly drove a lot of this. We understand that. I think that there is clearly a lot of political pressure. You see this very much in the United States for both mission aligned, right? This needs to benefit the Air Force. This needs to benefit, whoever the funder is, as well as ideologically acceptable, right? Only, climate change, right, is an area that is seeing this, for example, quite a lot in terms of what gets funded and what doesn't, and the government makes those decisions. Short-term cycles is a real problem, right? That you have to, get your results out there quickly, and you have to get them in high-profile journals and other things, right? Otherwise, you maybe don't get tenure. And if you don't get tenure, you don't have the academic freedom. So that's another one. And there's a huge amount of bureaucracy. I'm sure it's maybe much better here in Sweden than it is in the US, but the amount of time that we all spend writing grants and reports, right, just keeps going up and up and up. And, what we want to spend our time on is mentoring students and doing our research. And so, this freedom, this academic freedom requires trust, and trust requires integrity, and so we need to look at those things. And I think, again, you've heard about these already. And so maybe I'll just end by saying that, universities, technical societies, national academies like EVA play a key role in enabling that. And so I'm very pleased that this discussion is going on today, and thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Richard. I think that was an excellent complementary perspective to what we've heard so far. And with that, I would like to ask the three speakers, but also we have two new speakers to join me up here for a panel discussion. And in addition to the speakers I've already introduced, We have Professor Björn Ottersten, who's a leading researcher in signal processing and wireless communication, and who has extensive experience in European research policy and innovation ecosystem, not least by being a member of the Scientific Council of the European European Research Council, and also a recently elected fellow of EVA. Please, oh my God. I think you should. So, and then we also have Ulrika Björksten, Secretary General of Public and Science Sweden, which is an organization dedicated to strengthening the dialogue between science and society. So I think we have an excellent panel. I would like to first turn to Björn and Ulrika, since you didn't get a chance to have some opening remarks, and maybe say a little bit about yourself, but also perhaps some opening comments on what you've heard so far, or maybe something you haven't heard.
Okay. Well,
please go ahead.
Thank you very much for organizing this event and inviting me and giving me an opportunity to weigh in on this topic. So I'm a Swedish national, and I've been active at KTH in Stockholm for many years, but been working at the University of Luxembourg for the last 17 years or so. On this topic about trust in science, I think it's closely linked to trust in institutions, and specifically, I'd like to reflect on the trust of universities. The general public, most of them have no direct experience of science or research, but they perhaps do have, interacted or have an opinion about universities in terms of higher education. So I'd like to just reflect a bit on education and the role it plays in trust for institutions. And from Europe, we often look to the U.S. and admire the universities, the top universities, and their achievements and what they are able to do and attract talent and so on. But in terms of education, they have, I would argue, become very inaccessible for the vast majority, either because admissions are very, very competitive, but also the costs of entering these institutions are tremendous. So I think this is a problem when you have elite institutions which become inaccessible to the vast majority of a population, and that we see what's happening is the distrust of science is also an anti-elitism trend. Fortunately, I believe in Europe we still have accessibility for the vast majority to high-quality higher education. So I personally have shifted a bit in my view. I have admired these top institutions and so on, but I also think there is a backside here, and perhaps having elitism in research is not the same, or should not be the same, as having elitism in education. I think the drawbacks are large. When it comes to research and science, I think it's all about interaction. We've heard that from previous speakers. I think we are fortunate working in engineering sciences because interaction is in our DNA. I subscribe very much to the view that Richard showed here with the control loop and the interaction of basic science, applied science, and I think if you're working in engineering science as one individual or a team, you can be active in all of these at the same time and get to work with the private sector, with industry, with practitioners, entrepreneurs, and so on. And I think this, often the science we work on comes from challenges, real world challenges, and we like to see our discoveries and knowledge being put to use and implemented. And I think this is essential in building trust. Having worked in Scandinavia, this has been very natural here. It's strongly supported as well. When I came to Central Europe and worked at the university there, I was actually quite surprised when this was even questioned by some, that interacting with, in this case, the private sector or industry was in some respects frowned upon, which never occurred to me when I was in the US or in Scandinavia. I hope this is changing because I think it's essential for trust. I just like to say a few words about my other role in the ERC, because I think this is positive news. So the ERC funds research in Europe, and it's the first time that Europe has used the EU as a platform for competition rather than collaboration. Most of the funding that goes into research is in the competitiveness pillar, which is the mission-driven research, but the ERC funds curiosity-driven research. Sometimes this is confused with fundamental research. Now that's not it. It funds frontier research, which I claim is different, and it's curiosity-driven, so it's researcher-initiated. And it's very attractive because the funding is generous. It's 5 years, so it allows you to pivot, as we've heard, is important. And it has a rigorous peer review system that has been very well accepted by scientists in Europe. And I think if you want to gain trust in the public, you of course have to gain trust among the scientists to start with. And also, if we look at the Draghi and the Letty reports, they very much recognize the success of this institution, and they put a lot of criticism on the competitiveness part, which you can question if the use of that funding is so effective. And if we don't make effective use of public funding, that's a guarantee for losing public trust. And on a positive note, so the Commission, when they proposed their budget recently, they actually proposed a doubling of that funding. So over 5 billion euros annually for frontier research. So I think we see some positive trends as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those opening statements and also for relating it to the European level, which I think some of us in this room have also worked quite actively with. Ulrika, would you like to, and then I will slowly also open up if there are questions or comments from the audience.
Well, I think I'd like to continue on the line also that we must be very mindful not to think that Sweden or Europe is the US. I actually see a real danger that we follow the development in the US very closely, and we think that we have the same kind of polarization in Europe. But there's actually a lot of research, I don't have the references with me here now, but that show that polarization in Europe is not about knowledge polarization. It's value polarization and a very strong emotional polarization, where we dislike those that we disagree with more than we did before, but it's not necessarily that we have a different idea of what is true. We have different ideas of what we value. And I think we have to be very, very careful not to think that Europe has the American situation. And I think that our annual survey that we do, that I put out on all the seats, I mean, it does show that, and it's actually quite typical for European countries. I mean, there are differences in southeastern Europe, for instance. Trust in science is much lower. But what we see in Sweden is it's extremely stable. And I think what is interesting, that trust in science in Sweden actually grew during the pandemic. And I have thought quite a bit about why that happened. I know many other people have as well. But I think that one key to that is that science was discussed in a very open manner. At the time I was working for Swedish radio as science commentators, I was in the position of interpreting what the authorities were saying and discussing a lot with the authorities and the public. And I think that it was actually a very transparent debate where uncertainties were constantly being discussed in the public domain. And I think that was very different from many other countries where communication about the pandemic, there was too much certitude in how it was communicated. And I think that the American example of face masks or not face masks are a very good example of that, because rather than discussing in what kind of situations are face masks helpful and when aren't they, it became a political issue. So knowledge was polarized. That did not originally happen in Sweden and not so much in Europe, but we saw that debate from the US kind of infiltrating the Swedish debate as well. So, that's one of the reasons that I think we have to be mindful not to put ourselves in the same situation. There's another point that I'd like to bring to the table as well, and that is that I think we also have to remember that science and engineering, it's power. I mean, science is power, and I think that is also at the heart of the problem that science faces in a democracy. There's an interesting, actually American philosopher of science, Philip Kitcher, who's written quite extensively on this, on the relationship between science and democracy. And his argument has a lot to do with the structures of science actually grew, they came before democracy. So in a way, a kind of secular priesthood was our academies, it's a way of organizing a kind of secular priesthood. And I think we have to be mindful and understand that science and knowledge is power, and think about perhaps academic freedom as a way of separation of powers. So the academic power should be separated from the political power, but let's think about the separations of power. So that's a few of the things that I like to put on the table.
Very interesting points that I think you bring in that I think we could, all of them, discuss a lot further. I'm going to open the floor. It's a lot. So we'll take this one, the back, and then that one. 3. Please go ahead. And there's a microphone right next to your chair.
Hello. So my name is Mona Wilke. I'm the director of Stockholm University Ventures. We are turning research results, free research, to something good for the society or something commercial. I would like to bring up the freedom that we have in Sweden with the teacher's extension and the professor's privilege, which is lärarundantaget. And our responsibility to actually either tell the researcher that you have something in your test tube, or to take care of what is in the test tube.
So can we gather the questions and then we can see who would like to respond? We'll take that one.
So one thing that I had noticed that I think touches a lot of the things that have been mentioned before and led to Secretary Kennedy's statement that science is becoming faith-based. Many people in the United States, at least, and particularly among those who trust in science, they only place importance on the results of science as a set of facts, and place little to no importance on the underlying understanding that led to those results. So how could we address this misplaced importance in science?
Scientific. Do you also want to, sorry, I should have said, do you want to say also who you are?
My name is Aidan Lanfear. I'm just a student. So.
You're not just a student, you're a student. Please go ahead.
Lars Engvall, Uppsala University. I heard then from Professor Murray about the good situation when you got the tenure and you have the sabbatical and so forth. But then what about the way to your tenure? I heard Marie-Laure Salle talk about very much the problems inside universities with the publish and perish, which means that you can't do things just what you like to do to be innovative. So it would be interesting to hear about how you get that tenure in the American system, or are we in Europe more concerned about the publish and perish than you are in the US?
Excellent questions. I think we'll start with those. And also, if the other 3 speakers would like to react to what Ulrika and Björn have said. So I don't know who would like to start. We have the lärarundantaget, we have the focus on outcomes rather than maybe methods or process, which ties a little bit, I think, into what also has been said before. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm going to take this.
I think it's working.
No,
yeah.
A bit was off. On
it's
now?
on, yeah.
I'm going to take the question on outcome because I think it is very important, and I think it's connected if we bring it at the institutional level with something we've forgotten, I think, with respect to our universities. The tendency is really to look at universities as producers of things. So we produce students who will get a job. We produce research that will ultimately have an impact on society. But we've forgotten the democratic role of universities, the critical thinking, the production of citizens. And today, actually, it should be global citizens, because actually today we should understand our citizenship as being the citizenship to the planet. And so, you know, going back to Humboldt, really, and to this notion of the university as, before anything else, the place where you are going to be producing the critical thinking citizen who will be a very strong pillar of democracy. I think we've tended to forget that by turning actually our universities into more commercialized, in a sense, or commercializing institutions. So I totally relate with what you're saying, but I would extend it really at the level of the institution.
Thank you, Mario. I'll take Ulrika and then I have Björn.
Yeah, no, I'd like to add to that I think that what our survey also shows is that trust in universities' researchers are very high, but it's actually quite a bit lower in researchers in private enterprises. And I think that is also food for thought, perhaps especially in this assembly, about how to protect universities from being perceived as part of the kind of private enterprise sphere. I think that would erode trust in science.
Good point. Yeah, did you want to say?
So lärarundantaget was mentioned here. So since I have experience from both models, I mean, I could share my views on this. When I worked at KTH, I was very favorable to this. I saw how certain individuals were excellent at taking research results and spinning them off into enterprises and so on, and they did this multiple times and successfully. However, I also see a disadvantage is that it doesn't allow the institution to invest in supporting this process, and the majority of faculty members do not have the interest or skills to make this happen. And then I think support mechanisms at the institution should be a responsibility to make the results to bring them into practice. So I actually now favor a model where we don't have lärarundantaget, because it gives a responsibility to the institution to support the process. Of course, if the institution does this in the wrong way, it can also block the process, and of course that's not what we want to see. But let's assume that we have well-functioning institutions, and I think we can be more effective in Sweden in this respect.
I have Anna-Maria first, and then Sure.
So I was talking about science literacy. Is it on?
No.
I turned it off.
Now it's on. So I was talking about science literacy, and I really want to stress how important that is. You were talking about not just the outcome and the results and so on, but really for scientists and researchers and engineers to talk about the method. What is the scientific method? What is the process that is coming to the conclusion that we see in the end? And it's something also that I really try to tell the researchers that I work with, that do not just talk about the things that you are, the findings that you have and the results, but also about what you actually are doing, the method and the process of doing research. So, science literacy.
And so I think maybe I'll touch on a couple of things. One is, the tenure process and, the role of publications, and the others, sort of publishing the outputs a little bit, because I think they're related. And I guess there's a couple of things I want to say about it. So one is, it is true that the tenure before you get tenure, right, is a very different set of pressures, right, on a faculty member, right? And so you need to make sure that you are defining yourself well enough that the university can make a judgment that says we're now going to allow this person to, sort of stay at our university for as long as they want to stay at our university. And so turns off a set of things that I think can be very damaging. For example, it turns off often collaborations with others, especially collaborations with senior colleagues, right? Because then who really came up with that idea, right? You're working with somebody who's very famous, it's in their area, obviously they were the driver of it and you just sort of carried things out, right? That's not so great. I mean, I also think that it leads to, in some disciplines other than others, publishing in high impact factor journals, right? I hate impact factor as a measure of the worth of a paper, right? Because it's about the journal and the journal things, not about that particular paper. But nonetheless, it gets used as a proxy for sort of excellence, right? You know, hey, I published in Science, I published in Nature, I published in whatever journal. And that can be very damaging, in part because publishing those journals, right, you know, sort of leads to a certain type of result. It's got to be something that is new and flashy in a certain sense, right? Science, Nature, Cell. They publish the things that haven't been published before that are going to, you know, 2 of those are commercial enterprises, right? And so, you know, Cell and Nature Publishing, they're there to make money, and they make money in part by doing that. Now, they also do a public good, but, right, there's that sort of competing set of things. And it also leads to publishing the outputs and focusing on the outputs, right? Because it's that output of what happened, not how did I get there. It's interesting because when I sort of switched into synthetic biology, one of the things I saw was that the publishing culture was very different there, right? It was very much publish in high impact factor journals, you know, do things that really make a splash, don't talk to people until you're ready to publish your results, sometimes don't talk about things until they're published. Very different, say, than computer science, right? Where in computer science, people put on GitHub, right, in open source repositories, their work as they go, right? You can see it develop, right? You can see that process go. People start to use it, right? How do we get in, you know, disciplines more like that kind of open source computer science mentality is the way that we do things, right? And I think that's a wonderful mentality. And again, you know, in my field of controls, we have conferences and other things. We're constantly talking about partial results that are partway there that aren't there yet, and then you get input. You know, we were trying that and it didn't work very well, and you might sort of think about looking at it this way. I think that culture can be very important. I think it'd be very useful, and especially at that early stage, because you set in those first 6 or 7 years your style for the rest of your career, right? And if that was in a pressure cooker and I don't talk to people about it, that's what you pass on to your students, that's what they pass on to theirs, I think it can be very negative. So it is definitely an area that needs more work.
Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, time's flying, so I think I'd like to ask the panel to each make a final statement. And what I've taken from this, which I think has been a fascinating discussion, is this question of, you know, what is the origin of the problem with the erosion of trust in science? You know, and then that's obviously also tied to what might be the solution. So, is it a matter of engagement, awareness building, communication? Are there deeper, perhaps, mechanisms in the internal, right, science dynamics, also related to what you said, Björn, about accessibility, that might also be partially at play or at fault? Also, these differences that you pointed out, Ulrika, between countries. So, you know, what can Sweden do to make sure? I mean, can we be assured that this trust will be maintained, or what will it require? And perhaps also to you, Richard, where do you see this going, or what, you know? And a final point I would like to ask you all is because I think you talked about the role of educating democratic citizens, and you talked about the importance of accessibility of education. But one thing that troubles me very much is, in this age of technological disruption, where we're now seeing a cohort of students leaving university in professions that may no longer exist, how is that going to affect the trust in academic institutions? Because we know from research that, you know, your first job after you graduate actually puts you quite clearly as a cohort on the path of your future prosperity. So I think that is something that concerns me quite a lot, whether we are all immune to that, even Sweden, or how we're going to handle that. I'll allow one quick question, and then you have to give, please, very brief.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Carsten Bosen from the Danish Academy of Technical Science. One additional question maybe, have we done something ourselves in academia to deserve the increased distrust of politicians and so on? It could be that we are to some extent perceived as lobbying for more money to ourselves every time we speak, or lobbying for a specific political sort of statement or political party when professors are talking maybe outside their own sort of scientific background.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop the questions here, but I'll give you 30 seconds each to give you, sir, a final. Okay, you get a minute.
Okay. So I just want to underline this idea of power again, because I think that one thing that we do see is while trust in science is not dwindling in Sweden yet, perhaps, the optimism about where technology will bring us is beginning to dwindle. And I think that it would be a great mistake to think that the public is wrong in saying this. I think that we need to take that very seriously, because technology has changed very rapidly through the whole IT revolution and now with AI. And people are aware of that, and people are worried, and it would be very wrong to say that they are wrong. So that's one thing. Another thing that there are two other things that I would like to underline, and that is, we've already touched upon it here, that idea of equality, and that, I mean, equality builds trust, and that is true also for equality in knowledge, of course. And I think in Sweden we need to think a lot about the word folkbildning, and cherish that, because I think that is a reason that there is such a high trust in science in Sweden, and that we don't see very big differences if you're university educated or not, how high your trust is. The third point I want to make is that I think that scientists need to build ethics into their everyday work, and that is because scientists and engineers are developing technology that is changing society at a very fast rate. And so we need to build ethical reflection into the production of that knowledge. And I think we would have to think quite carefully about how to do that in a good way.
Excellent. Thank you. Ailwa.
I will actually build on this by saying that we really need to have a serious look at our internal dynamics, and I mentioned a lot, and you actually built on that. I think that we know all this, and we know the impact it has on the trust in science. So I think this is really a call for action on our part to actually question the way in which we've been organizing science as a social field and rethinking including the ethical dimension, very much so, and rethinking the way in which we organize that field. And that's a major undertaking, which is very difficult, because obviously you have a lot of, built-in interest for that not to change. And the second point that I want to underscore is really thinking about how the university can kind of regain some form of political, in the very strong and positive sense of the term, role in the current context. And I think it goes through education, indeed. I mean, this has been mentioned. So it goes through education in the sense of our capacity to actually, train people who will be able to deal with this world where, it's not the knowledge we give them, it's the way in which they are going to be critical thinkers and learners for themselves, which will allow them to go into a world where they'll have to constantly reinvent themselves. And so we have to actually transform the way we train our students. We have to go back to this notion of the university producing responsible and critical thinking citizens, and this will regenerate, I think, the trust in the institution, allowing the research part to, continue.
Thank you. Go ahead, Richard.
So I think I'll come back to something that I said, which is that it's a distributed problem with a lot of interactions. It's a network problem, and so we have to not just think about the trust of the public in science, but the trust of the government in universities in the United States. That's a big challenge right now, and we have to rebuild that trust. The trust, between the public and the government. Or does the public trust the government to do the right things? Another area, right? And so I think we need to look at each of those. Kind of think of that as a network diagram, and each of those edges representing that trust, and say, why is that eroding, and what should we do about it, right? And not just focus on one piece, but really think through that whole system. It makes it more complicated. I think that's just the way it is, but I think we need to, kind of look back and sort of understand, why are all of those eroding, right? Is one of them worse than the others? Where should we put our time?
Yeah, good point. Jan.
Well, when I'm pessimistic, I worry about social media, generative AI, misinformation, disinformation, and the pace that this is going. When I'm optimistic, I think, well, maybe this will reinforce critical thinking, this will reinforce education and the role of universities. As has been said before, I think we need to reflect internally and be self-critical also. I don't have a solution how we can, increase the trust, But I think we cannot just blame things that are happening outside of us. We have to reflect internally as well.
Thank you.
So I think that it's important to think as science communication and public engagement as a tool to really enhance and safeguard science. But it's also a tool to bridge the gap between science and society. And when I talk about science communication, I'm not only talking about one way to publish an article or giving a speech, giving a talk or something, but to really interact between science and society, to engage, to have a dialogue, and even, as I said before, co-create, so that you sort of bridge the gap between science and society. And I think then we can have a wider understanding from society what science is really about.
Well, thank you so much. I personally thought this was a fantastic discussion. I think we just touched upon a number of, like, I would have loved to talk more about power. I think that would have been really interesting, but also the different levels of trust that you talked about, or different, trust-based relationships, or the erosion of those, educating citizens for this future, I think would be, I would just like to finish off by saying, I think one of the things I take away from this is that if we come to a point where we think to have to protect science from society or from the government, that's a moment when it's a society that's in trouble. And I don't think that can be the goal, right? It can't be the goal that we have to sort of try to isolate science from society. So with that, I want to thank you all very much for attending the seminar. I want to thank the speakers. I think it was really an excellent mix, so we could have gone on much longer. But let's continue with a glass of something. Thank you.